While I was recovering from severe PTSD and a traumatic brain injury that left me unable to leave my bedroom for months, my husband David and his real estate agent, Monica, forged my signature to drain our $1.8 million accounts, sold our 3 rental properties, and convinced everyone I was mentally unstable, until my deceased grandmother's $400 million military contractor inheritance surfaced with one impossible condition. Only I could claim it within 60 days by proving I was still mentally fit to run a defense company. The medication fog made everything feel like I was swimming through thick honey, but those words cut through the haze like shrapnel through flesh. She's completely lost it this time. The doctors say she might never recover, enough to handle basic decisions, let alone manage money. David's voice carried that patronizing tone I'd started recognizing over our 6 years of marriage, the one he used when he thought he was being clever while talking to people he considered beneath him. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, retired Army intelligence, and 3 months ago I was leading cybersecurity operations for the Department of Defense. Now I was supposedly a broken shell of a woman, trapped in my own bedroom, unable to function in normal society. The improvised, explosive device that destroyed my convoy in Afghanistan had left me with fragments in my brain and scars that went deeper than the ones you could see. But what the doctors called traumatic brain injury and severe PTSD, I was beginning to understand might be something else entirely. The explosion had happened during my final deployment, just 8 weeks before I was scheduled to return home permanently. After 15 years of active duty, I was finally ready to settle down with David and start the family we'd been planning. The blast changed everything. 3 soldiers died that day, and I came home carrying their memories along with metal fragments the surgeons couldn't safely remove. David had seemed so supportive during those first weeks after I returned. He'd taken leave from his job at the real estate development firm, attended every medical appointment, held my hand through the panic attacks that came without warning. When the doctors recommended I take early retirement with full disability, benefits David had been encouraging. "You've given enough, Sarah. It's time to take care of yourself. Let me take care of the business side of things while you focus on healing." The business side of things. That phrase should have been my first warning, but I was drowning in medication and trauma responses that made normal thinking feel impossible. Our financial portfolio was substantial. My military salary had been supplemented by consulting work in cybersecurity, plus the rental properties we'd bought as investments over the years. Combined with my disability payments and the inheritance from my parents, we were sitting on close to $2 million in assets. I'd trusted David completely when he suggested consolidating our finances to make management easier during my recovery. Joint accounts, shared access to investment portfolios, power of attorney documents that would let him handle everything while I focused on getting better. It all seemed reasonable, loving even. He was protecting me from stress that might interfere with my healing process. Through my bedroom window, I could see David pacing on our back deck, phone pressed to his ear, that familiar gesture he made when he was closing a big deal. But the conversations I'd been overhearing lately weren't about his legitimate real estate business. They were about my real estate, my investments, my disability payments. And about Monica Reeves, the 30-something redhead from his office who'd been spending an awful lot of time at our house lately, supposedly helping with paperwork. The irony wasn't lost on me that a woman trained in intelligence gathering was only now recognizing the signs of a long-term operation being conducted against her. David's behavior patterns that I'd attributed to stress about my condition were actually something else entirely. The way he'd started showering immediately after coming home from work. The expensive cologne that appeared in our bathroom. The weekend client meetings that required overnight trips to Portland. The credit card statements he'd started handling exclusively, claiming he didn't want to burden me with financial details during my recovery. Monica's presence in our house had increased gradually, so subtly that I'd barely noticed the progression. First, she was just dropping off documents for David to review. Then she was staying for dinner because they had complex transactions to discuss. Eventually, she was practically living here 3 days a week, claiming she needed to use our home office because the main office was being renovated. Her laughter echoed through our house at all hours, sharp and confident in a way that reminded me of weapons being cleaned and loaded. What I hadn't realized until yesterday was how much David had been manipulating my medical care to serve his purposes. Dr. Peterson, my psychiatrist at the VA, had been prescribing increasingly stronger medications for my PTSD symptoms. But when I'd started questioning why the medications seemed to make my thinking cloudier rather than clearer, David had convinced Dr. Peterson that my resistance to treatment was part of my psychological deterioration. She's becoming paranoid. About her own care team, David had told Dr. Peterson during a session I was supposed to be too medicated to remember clearly. She thinks people are trying to control her, that her medications are being used against her. It's exactly the kind of thinking that shows how severe her condition has become. Dr. Peterson had nodded sympathetically and increased my dosage, explaining that paranoid thoughts were common in severe PTSD cases and that higher medication levels would help stabilize my thinking. Paranoid thoughts. The term made me want to laugh, except nothing about this situation was funny. 15 years of military intelligence work had taught me to recognize patterns, to identify when someone was running a psychological operation against a target. The gradual isolation from my military friends, who David claimed were triggering my PTSD symptoms with their visits. The way he'd convinced my sister Rebecca that my angry outbursts about missing money were evidence of my deteriorating mental state. The systematic undermining of my credibility with every person who might have questioned what was happening to me. 3 days ago, I'd forced myself to stay awake through my evening medication cycle, fighting the drowsiness that usually knocked me unconscious within an hour of taking my pills. That's when I'd overheard the phone conversation that changed everything. David had been in the kitchen, probably assuming I was safely sedated for the night, talking to someone about liquidating assets before anyone could question the transactions. The disability payments are automatic deposit, but the investment accounts need her signature for major withdrawals, David had said. The power of attorney covers most of it, but for the rental property sales, we need documents that look like she's actively participating in the decisions. Monica's been practicing her signature for weeks. The forgeries are perfect now. Forgeries. Monica had been forging my signature on legal documents, probably for weeks or months, while I'd been too medicated to notice that my own name was being signed to papers I'd never seen. The rental properties that represented years of careful investment were being sold without my knowledge, the proceeds disappearing into accounts I had no access to. But the conversation had continued, and the next part had made my blood freeze, despite the medication fog. Once we have everything liquidated and transferred, we can have her committed for long-term psychiatric care. Dr. Peterson already thinks she's a danger to herself. A few more incidents, maybe some evidence that she's threatened suicide, and we can get a court order for indefinite hospitalization. After that, the power of attorney becomes permanent, and we can do whatever we want with any remaining assets, committed for long-term psychiatric care. David wasn't just stealing my money. He was planning to have me permanently institutionalized to prevent me from ever discovering or challenging his theft. The loving, supportive husband who'd promised to help me heal was actually orchestrating my complete destruction while making it look like the natural progression of my mental illness. The most terrifying part was how well the plan was working. My sister Rebecca, who'd been my closest friend and ally for 35 years, had stopped visiting after David convinced her that my paranoid accusations about missing money were evidence of my deteriorating condition. My former commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, had been told that I was too unstable for any contact with my former colleagues. Even my therapist at the VA had been systematically fed information designed to make my legitimate concerns appear to be symptoms of severe psychiatric breakdown. Dr. Peterson had been particularly easy to manipulate because he genuinely wanted to help veterans struggling with PTSD. When David presented him with carefully documented evidence of my increasingly erratic behavior, behavior that was actually my growing awareness that something was wrong. Dr. Peterson had interpreted my questions and concerns as confirmation of his diagnosis. Every time I'd tried to discuss missing money or forged signatures, it had been recorded in my medical file as evidence of paranoid delusions. The psychological operation against me had been masterful in its simplicity. David had taken my legitimate trauma from military service and used it as cover for systematic financial abuse. My PTSD symptoms provided perfect camouflage for his theft, while my medication made it nearly impossible for me to think clearly enough to gather evidence or fight back effectively. Anyone who might have helped me had been convinced that my accusations were symptoms of my mental illness rather than accurate observations of criminal activity. Yesterday's revelation about the inheritance had been the first piece of information David hadn't been able to control or manipulate. The certified letter had been delivered while David was at work, and Monica was handling her real estate appointments. I'd been having one of my clearer days, and I'd managed to retrieve the mail before either of them returned. The letterhead alone had been enough to shock me into complete alertness. Patterson, Brooks & Associates, military estate attorneys, serving the families of defense contractors since 1952. My grandmother, Colonel Elizabeth Mitchell, had died when I was 12 years old. At least that's what my family had always told me. According to family stories, she'd cut contact with our family after some bitter dispute with my father about my military career aspirations. She'd supposedly died alone and penniless, a bitter old woman who'd chosen pride over family relationships. But the letter in my hands told a completely different story. Colonel Elizabeth Mitchell had not only been alive until 6 months ago, she'd been running one of the largest private military contracting firms in the country. Mitchell Defense Solutions had contracts with the Pentagon, the CIA, and defense departments in 12 allied nations. The company she'd built over 40 years was worth approximately $400 million, and according to her will, it all belonged to me. But there were conditions. The inheritance came with requirements that seemed designed to test whether I was still the strong, independent officer she'd trained me to be. I had to appear in person at the law firm in Washington, D.C., within 60 days of notification. I had to pass psychological and cognitive evaluations to prove I was mentally competent to run a defense contracting company. Most importantly, I had to demonstrate that I was acting of my own free will, without coercion or undue influence from any party who might benefit from my inheritance. The letter had been dated 3 weeks ago. David and Monica had no idea it existed, which meant I had approximately 40 days to figure out how to travel to Washington, pass a competency evaluation, and claim an inheritance that would make their theft of my $2 million look like pocket change. 40 days to prove I was still Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, not the broken, incompetent woman they'd spent months creating through systematic psychological abuse. But as I sat in my bedroom, holding the letter that represented either salvation or an impossible challenge, I realized something that should have terrified me, but instead filled me with the first genuine hope I'd felt in months. David and Monica had made one crucial mistake in their psychological operation against me. They'd underestimated exactly what kind of soldier they were trying to destroy. 2 years before the convoy explosion that changed everything, I was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, one of the youngest female officers ever promoted to that rank, in Army intelligence. My specialty was cyber warfare and psychological operations. Ironic, considering I was now the target of the most sophisticated psyop I'd ever encountered. But back then, I was the one running operations, protecting American interests from enemies who tried to use deception and manipulation as weapons. I'd met David Martinez at a military appreciation gala in Seattle, where he was representing his real estate development company's veteran housing initiative. He was charming, successful, and seemed genuinely impressed by my military career rather than intimidated by it. Most civilian men I'd dated had struggled with the idea of being involved with a woman who outranked generals and briefed senators on national security threats. David was different. He asked intelligent questions about my work, supported my career goals, and never once suggested that I should consider leaving the military for a more traditional lifestyle. Our courtship had been everything I'd thought I wanted. David understood the demands of my deployment schedule, sent care packages when I was overseas, and made our relationship feel like a safe harbor I could return to after months of high-stress operations. When he proposed during my leave before my final deployment, it felt like perfect timing. I would complete my 15-year commitment to the Army, retire with full benefits, and we'd build a civilian life together using the skills and security clearance I'd developed during my service. Chiwi. Business partnership had been David's idea, and it had seemed brilliant at the time. My cybersecurity expertise was in high demand among private corporations who needed to protect themselves from increasingly sophisticated cyber attacks. David's real estate connections provided a network of potential clients who needed exactly the kind of services I could offer. We'd planned to start our consulting firm as soon as I returned from Afghanistan, combining my technical knowledge with his business development skills. My grandmother's supposed death when I was 12 had been one of the defining traumas of my childhood. Elizabeth Mitchell had been a legend in our family, the first woman to graduate from West Point in her class, the officer who'd commanded respect in rooms full of men who believed women had no place in combat leadership. She'd encouraged my own military ambitions from the time I was old enough to understand what the Army meant. But according to my parents, she'd violently opposed my father's decision to leave the military for civilian life, and the resulting conflict had torn our family apart permanently. Growing up, I'd been told that my grandmother had cut all contact with us after accusing my father of betraying the Mitchell family legacy. She'd supposedly refused to acknowledge my existence, viewing me as the daughter of a deserter rather than the granddaughter of a proud military lineage. When my parents told me she'd died alone and bitter, having spent her final years consumed by anger over my father's choices, it had reinforced my determination to honor the Mitchell name through my own military service. The truth, as I was beginning to understand, had been far more complex. My grandmother hadn't abandoned our family out of bitterness. She'd been building something, preparing for a future where the Mitchell name would represent more than just military service. Mitchell Defense Solutions hadn't been just a business venture. It had been a legacy project designed to provide security and opportunity for military families long after individual careers ended. The rental properties David and I had purchased during our marriage represented my attempt to build financial security for our future family. 3 houses in rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods, each one carefully selected for its potential appreciation value and rental income. I'd used my deployment savings and military housing allowances to fund the down payments, while David handled the property management and tenant relationships. Together, the properties were worth nearly $800,000 and generated enough rental income to cover their mortgages with substantial profits left over. But the properties were just part of our financial picture. My military consulting work had been lucrative enough to fund a substantial investment portfolio, managed through a financial advisor who specialized in military retirement planning. Combined with my disability payments, David's real estate income, and the rental profits, we were on track to be financially independent within a decade. Everything had been planned, organized, and legally structured to protect our shared future. The convoy explosion had happened on what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance mission in the supposedly secure zone outside Kabul. Intelligence. Reports had indicated the area was clear of hostile activity, but someone had been feeding false information to coalition forces for weeks. The improvised explosive device had been perfectly positioned to cause maximum damage to our vehicles, while creating the appearance of a random attack rather than a targeted operation. 3 soldiers died immediately. Sergeant Rodriguez, who'd been planning to start college when he returned home, Lieutenant Peterson, who'd been engaged to his high school sweetheart, and Corporal Johnson, who'd been showing everyone pictures of his newborn daughter just that morning. I'd survived because I'd been in the rear vehicle, which took less direct damage from the blast. But the fragments that entered my brain had caused damage that doctors described as both miraculous and devastating. Miraculous that I'd survived it all. Devastating in terms of the long-term effects on my cognitive function. The medical evaluation process had been extensive and confusing. Traumatic brain injury symptoms could include everything from memory problems to personality changes to difficulty processing complex information. PTSD symptoms overlapped significantly, with TBI effects, making it nearly impossible to determine which issues were caused by physical brain damage and which were psychological responses to trauma. The medical team at Walter Reed had been honest about the uncertainty. Some patients recovered completely within months. Others struggled with permanent disabilities that affected every aspect of their lives. David had been present for every medical consultation, taking detailed notes and asking questions that seemed supportive, but were actually designed to emphasize my limitations rather than my potential for recovery. When doctors mentioned that TBI patients sometimes experience decision-making difficulties, David would bring up examples of times I'd seemed confused or disoriented. When therapists discussed PTSD symptoms, David would provide additional details about my behavior that painted a picture of someone whose judgment was fundamentally compromised. The medication regimen had started reasonably, standard treatments for managing TBI symptoms and PTSD triggers. But over time, the dosages had increased substantially, and new medications had been added to address side effects from the original prescriptions. Dr. Peterson at the VA had been convinced that my resistance to certain medications was evidence of my deteriorating psychological state rather than legitimate concerns about their effects on my thinking abilities. Monica Reeves had entered our lives gradually, initially as just another colleague from David's real estate office. She was competent, professional, and seemed genuinely committed to helping veteran families find suitable housing. Her involvement in our personal affairs had escalated so slowly that I'd barely noticed the progression from occasional work discussions to regular presence in our home to apparent partnership in managing our financial affairs. What I hadn't recognized at the time was that Monica's expertise wasn't just in real estate. She had experience in financial management and legal document preparation. The combination of skills made her the perfect accomplice for someone planning to systematically transfer assets without the owner's knowledge or consent. Her legitimate real estate business provided cover for the property sales, while her understanding of legal procedures allowed her to create convincing forgeries and fraudulent documentation. The psychological manipulation had been as sophisticated as any military operation I'd ever studied. David had systematically isolated me from my support network by convincing everyone that contact with my former colleagues was triggering my PTSD symptoms. My sister Rebecca, who'd been my closest confidant throughout my military career, had been told that my accusations about financial irregularities were evidence of paranoid thinking associated with my brain injury. Colonel Martinez, my former commanding officer, had been particularly easy to manipulate because he genuinely cared about my welfare. When David contacted him to explain that I was struggling with severe psychological symptoms and that contact with military personnel was interfering with my recovery, Martinez had reluctantly agreed to minimize communication. He'd been told that my doctors recommended limiting stimulation that might trigger memories of combat trauma. The financial power of attorney had been presented to me during one of my heavily medicated periods, shortly after a particularly severe panic attack that had left me feeling completely overwhelmed by any complex decision-making. David had explained that the documents would allow him to handle routine financial management, while I focused on healing, preventing me from being stressed by bills, investment decisions, or tax obligations. The legal language had been too complex for me to process clearly, and David's explanations had seemed reasonable and protective. Dr. Peterson's involvement had been crucial to the success of David's operation. As a VA psychiatrist with extensive experience treating combat veterans, Dr. Peterson's professional opinions carried significant weight with other medical providers, legal professionals, and family members. When he documented my paranoid concerns about financial theft as evidence of psychological deterioration, it provided David with medical legitimacy for his claims about my incompetence. The gradual escalation of my medication had served multiple purposes in David's plan. Higher dosages made it more difficult for me to think clearly enough to notice irregularities in our financial accounts. The side effects, drowsiness, confusion, memory problems, provided additional evidence of my deteriorating mental state. Most importantly, the medications made it nearly impossible for me to function effectively if I did try to challenge David's control over our finances. The rental property sales had been the most audacious part of the theft. Each property required extensive legal documentation, title transfers, and coordination with buyers, lenders, and government agencies. The fact that David and Monica had successfully completed 3 separate real estate transactions using forged signatures demonstrated both the sophistication of their criminal operation and the effectiveness of their psychological campaign against me. But yesterday's discovery of my grandmother's inheritance letter had revealed something David couldn't have anticipated. Elizabeth Mitchell hadn't just been a retired Army officer. She'd been a defense contractor with security clearances and government connections that extended far beyond anything David understood. The 60-day deadline for claiming the inheritance wasn't just a legal formality. It was a test designed to determine whether I was still the officer my grandmother had trained me to be. The inheritance conditions seemed impossible from my current position. Traveling to Washington, D.C. while supposedly incapacitated by severe PTSD and TBI. Passing psychological evaluations while taking medications that interfered with cognitive function. Demonstrating independence while under David's legal and financial control. But the requirements weren't really about my current capabilities. They were about my determination to reclaim the strength I'd always possessed. As I sat in my bedroom, holding the letter that represented either salvation or an impossible challenge, I realized that David and Monica had made one fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed that destroying Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell would leave behind a helpless victim. They hadn't considered the possibility that it might instead create a very dangerous enemy. The morning everything changed started like every other morning since my return from Afghanistan. David brought me my medication with breakfast, kissed my forehead with practiced tenderness, and reminded me that he'd be showing properties all day with Monica. Dr. Peterson had increased my dosage again after our session yesterday, where I'd made the mistake of mentioning that some of our financial statements looked different than I remembered. David had been there to explain to the doctor that my confusion about money was becoming more frequent and more concerning. The important thing is that you don't stress yourself about financial details, David had said, holding my hand while addressing Dr. Peterson as if I weren't fully present in the room. Sarah's always been meticulous about money management, so when she starts seeing problems that aren't there, it's a clear indicator that her cognitive function is deteriorating. Dr. Peterson had nodded sympathetically and prescribed stronger medication to help with what he termed anxiety-induced paranoid thinking. But this morning felt different because I'd made a decision during the sleepless hours after discovering my grandmother's inheritance letter. I was going to start fighting back, beginning with the simplest act of resistance I could manage. I wasn't going to take my morning medication. For the first time in months, I palmed the pills David handed me and waited until he left the room, before flushing them down the bathroom sink. The withdrawal from the heavy sedatives was immediate and uncomfortable. Within an hour, I was experiencing tremors, nausea, and a hypersensitivity to sound and light that made everything feel overwhelming. But underneath the physical discomfort, something else was emerging. Clarity. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, my thoughts weren't moving through the thick fog that had become my normal state of consciousness. The medical evaluation process had been extensive and confusing. Traumatic brain injury symptoms could include everything from memory problems to personality changes to difficulty processing complex information. PTSD symptoms overlapped significantly, with TBI effects, making it nearly impossible to determine which issues were caused by physical brain damage and which were psychological responses to trauma. The medical team at Walter Reed had been honest about the uncertainty. Some patients recovered completely within months. Others struggled with permanent disabilities that affected every aspect of their lives. David had been present for every medical consultation, taking detailed notes and asking questions that seemed supportive but were actually designed to emphasize my limitations rather than my potential for recovery. When doctors mentioned that TBI patients sometimes experience decision-making difficulties, David would bring up examples of times I'd seemed confused or disoriented. When therapists discussed PTSD symptoms, David would provide additional details about my behavior that painted a picture of someone whose judgment was fundamentally compromised. The medication regimen had started reasonably, standard treatments for managing TBI symptoms and PTSD triggers. But over time, the dosages had increased substantially, and new medications had been added to address side effects from the original prescriptions. Dr. Peterson at the VA had been convinced that my resistance to certain medications was evidence of my deteriorating psychological state, rather than legitimate concerns about their effects on my thinking abilities. Monica Reeves had entered our lives gradually, initially as just another colleague from David's real estate office. She was competent, professional, and seemed genuinely committed to helping veteran families find suitable housing. Her involvement in our personal affairs had escalated so slowly that I'd barely noticed the progression from occasional work discussions to regular presence in our home to apparent partnership in managing our financial affairs. What I hadn't recognized at the time was that Monica's expertise wasn't just in real estate. She had experience in financial management and legal document preparation. The combination of skills made her the perfect accomplice for someone planning to systematically transfer assets without the owner's knowledge or consent. Her legitimate real estate business provided cover for the property sales, while her understanding of legal procedures allowed her to create convincing forgeries and fraudulent documentation. The psychological manipulation had been as sophisticated as any military operation I'd ever studied. David had systematically isolated me from my support network by convincing everyone that contact with my former colleagues was triggering my PTSD symptoms. My sister Rebecca, who'd been my closest confidant throughout my military career, had been told that my accusations about financial irregularities were evidence of paranoid thinking associated with my brain injury. Colonel Martinez, my former commanding officer, had been particularly easy to manipulate because he genuinely cared about my welfare. When David contacted him to explain that I was struggling with severe psychological symptoms and that contact with military personnel was interfering with my recovery, Martinez had reluctantly agreed to minimize communication. He'd been told that my doctors recommended limiting stimulation that might trigger memories of combat trauma. The financial power of attorney had been presented to me during one of my heavily medicated periods, shortly after a particularly severe panic attack that had left me feeling completely overwhelmed by any complex decision-making. David had explained that the documents would allow him to handle routine financial management while I focused on healing, preventing me from being stressed by bills, investment decisions, or tax obligations. The legal language had been too complex for me to process clearly, and David's explanations had seemed reasonable and protective. Dr. Peterson's involvement had been crucial to the success of David's operation. As a VA psychiatrist with extensive experience treating combat veterans, Dr. Peterson's professional opinions carried significant weight with other medical providers, legal professionals, and family members. When he documented my paranoid concerns about financial theft as evidence of psychological deterioration, it provided David with medical legitimacy for his claims about my incompetence. The gradual escalation of my medication had served multiple purposes in David's plan. Higher dosages made it more difficult for me to think clearly enough to notice irregularities in our financial accounts. The side effects, drowsiness, confusion, memory problems, provided additional evidence of my deteriorating mental state. Most importantly, The medications made it nearly impossible for me to function effectively if I did try to challenge David's control over our finances. The rental property sales had been the most audacious part of the theft. Each property required extensive legal documentation, title transfers, and coordination with buyers, lenders, and government agencies. The fact that David and Monica had successfully completed 3 separate real estate transactions using forged signatures demonstrated both the sophistication of their criminal operation and the effectiveness of their psychological campaign against me. But yesterday's discovery of my grandmother's inheritance letter had revealed something David couldn't have anticipated. Elizabeth Mitchell hadn't just been a retired Army officer. She'd been a defense contractor with security clearances and government connections that extended far beyond anything David understood. The 60-day deadline for claiming the inheritance wasn't just a legal formality. It was a test designed to determine whether I was still the officer my grandmother had trained me to be. The inheritance conditions seemed impossible from my current position. Traveling to Washington, D.C., while supposedly incapacitated by severe PTSD and TBI, passing psychological evaluations while taking medications that interfered with cognitive function, demonstrating independence while under David's legal and financial control. But the requirements weren't really about my current capabilities. They were about my determination to reclaim the strength I'd always possessed. As I sat in my bedroom, holding the letter that represented either salvation or an impossible challenge, I realized that David and Monica had made one fundamental miscalculation. They'd assumed that destroying Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell would leave behind a helpless victim. They hadn't considered the possibility that it might instead create a very dangerous enemy. The morning everything changed started like every other morning since my return from Afghanistan. David brought me my medication with breakfast, kissed my forehead with practiced tenderness, and reminded me that he'd be showing properties all day with Monica. Dr. Peterson had increased my dosage again after our session yesterday, where I'd made the mistake of mentioning that some of our financial statements looked different than I remembered. David had been there to explain to the doctor that my confusion about money was becoming more frequent and more concerning. The important thing is that you don't stress yourself about financial details, David had said, holding my hand while addressing Dr. Peterson as if I weren't fully present in the room. Sarah's always been meticulous about money management, so when she starts seeing problems that aren't there, it's a clear indicator that her cognitive function is deteriorating. Dr. Peterson had nodded sympathetically and prescribed stronger medication to help with what he termed anxiety-induced paranoid thinking. But this morning felt different because I'd made a decision during the sleepless hours after discovering my grandmother's inheritance letter. I was going to start fighting back, beginning with the simplest act of resistance I could manage. I wasn't going to take my morning medication. For the first time in months, I palmed the pills David handed me and waited until he left the room, before flushing them down the bathroom sink. The withdrawal from the heavy sedatives was immediate and uncomfortable. Within an hour, I was experiencing tremors, nausea, and a hypersensitivity to sound and light that made everything feel overwhelming. But underneath the physical discomfort, something else was emerging: clarity. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, my thoughts weren't moving through the thick fog that had become my normal state of consciousness. With my mind beginning to clear, I could finally assess my situation with the analytical skills that had made me successful in military intelligence. David's operation against me had been methodical and comprehensive, but it had also created vulnerabilities that I could exploit if I was smart enough and strong enough to capitalize on them. The first step was understanding exactly what had been done to me and gathering evidence that could support my eventual counterattack. I started with our home computer, which David had told me was too complex for me to use safely in my current condition. The password was still the same one we'd always used, a combination of our anniversary date and my military identification number. What I found in David's email folders made my stomach clench with a mixture of rage and recognition. This wasn't just financial theft. It was a sophisticated psychological warfare operation designed to completely destroy my identity and credibility. Email after email documented David's communications with Monica about liquidating my assets. The rental properties had been sold over the past 6 weeks, with Monica handling the legal documentation and David managing the buyer relationships. The proceeds, nearly $800,000, had been transferred to accounts I had no access to. But more disturbing were the emails discussing my medical treatment and the timeline for having me permanently institutionalized. Dr. Peterson is convinced that Sarah's paranoid episodes are escalating, David had written to Monica 3 days ago. He's recommending inpatient psychiatric evaluation if her condition continues to deteriorate. I'm going to start documenting more incidents of erratic behavior to support a commitment order. Once she's been declared mentally incompetent by the court system, the power of attorney becomes permanent and irrevocable. Another email, dated just last week, contained David's strategy for ensuring my permanent incapacitation. The key is making her appear dangerous to herself or others. I've been saving recordings of her worst panic attacks, and Monica has been documenting times when Sarah seemed confused or disoriented. If we can create a pattern that shows escalating instability, we can have her committed indefinitely while appearing to be concerned family members trying to protect her. The most chilling discovery was a folder labeled Sarah's Incidents, which contained video recordings of my worst moments over the past several months. David had been secretly filming me during panic attacks, medication reactions, and therapy sessions. The footage had been edited to remove context and emphasize moments when I appeared confused, agitated, or irrational. It was a comprehensive collection of evidence designed to support claims of severe mental illness. But David had made one crucial mistake in his documentation. He'd also saved emails that revealed the systematic manipulation of my medical care. Communications with Dr. Peterson discussed strategies for increasing my medication without my knowledge, timing psychiatric evaluations during my most heavily medicated periods, and interpreting my legitimate concerns about financial irregularities as symptoms of paranoid delusions. More damaging were David's communications with someone identified only as Dr. Stevens about medication protocols that would ensure long-term cognitive impairment. The emails discussed specific drug combinations that would create permanent psychological dependence while maintaining the appearance of legitimate psychiatric treatment. Dr. Stevens had apparently provided David with detailed instructions for gradually increasing dosages in ways that would cause maximum confusion while avoiding obvious signs of drug abuse. The financial documentation was equally comprehensive and incriminating. David had created detailed spreadsheets tracking the liquidation of my assets, including projected timelines for accessing my military retirement accounts and disability payments. The documents showed that he and Monica had been planning this operation for over 18 months, beginning long before my convoy was attacked in Afghanistan. What truly shocked me was discovering that David had been in communication with my former colleagues at the Department of Defense, systematically undermining my professional reputation while gathering information about my financial assets and security clearances. He'd convinced several people that my PTSD symptoms were so severe that I posed a potential security risk, leading to the suspension of my consulting contracts and the freezing of several income streams I hadn't even realized were missing. But the most devastating discovery was buried in a folder labeled Insurance Claims. David had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on me 6 months before my final deployment, with himself as the sole beneficiary. The policy included clauses that would pay double benefits in case of suicide, and David's emails discussed strategies for making my eventual death appear to be the result of PTSD-related self-harm rather than foul play. The beauty of the psychiatric commitment route, David had written to Monica, is that it establishes a clear pattern of mental illness and suicidal ideation. If Sarah has an accident or incident while in psychiatric care, the insurance investigation will focus on her documented history of instability rather than questioning external factors. This wasn't just theft or even fraud. David was planning my murder while making it appear to be the tragic but predictable result of combat-related mental illness. The operation was so sophisticated and comprehensive that it would likely succeed unless I could find a way to expose it before David moved to the final phase of his plan. As I continued searching through David's digital files, I found evidence that this wasn't his first time targeting a vulnerable woman. There were communications with Monica dating back 3 years, discussing a previous client named Jennifer Walsh, who had supposedly committed suicide after struggling with depression following her husband's death. The details were eerily similar to my own situation: gradual isolation, financial manipulation, medical gaslighting, and eventual institutionalization followed by convenient death. Jennifer Walsh had been a wealthy widow whose husband had left. Her substantial assets, including real estate investments and business interests. Monica had been her real estate agent, while David had been introduced as a financial advisor who specialized in helping women manage inherited wealth. Within 18 months, Jennifer had been declared mentally incompetent, institutionalized, for psychiatric treatment, and found dead in her hospital room from what was ruled an accidental overdose of psychiatric medication. The parallels were unmistakable and terrifying. David and Monica weren't just opportunistic criminals. They were serial predators who had developed a systematic method for targeting, isolating, and destroying vulnerable women while stealing their assets. My military background and supposed PTSD symptoms had made me their ideal next victim, providing perfect cover for the psychological manipulation and medical abuse they needed to execute their plan. But as I absorbed the full scope of what David and Monica had been doing to me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the convoy explosion. The cold, calculating anger of a professional soldier who had identified an enemy that needed to be eliminated. These weren't just criminals who had stolen money. They were predators who had murdered at least one woman and were planning to murder me while desecrating the memory of my fallen soldiers by using my combat trauma as cover for their crimes. The inheritance letter from my grandmother's estate attorneys suddenly took on new significance. Elizabeth Mitchell hadn't just been a successful defense contractor, she'd been a woman who understood how predators operated and how to fight back against them. The 60-day deadline and competency requirements weren't just legal formalities, they were challenges designed to determine whether I was still capable of the kind of strategic thinking and decisive action that had made the Mitchell name respected in military circles. David's afternoon phone call to Monica provided the final piece of information I needed to understand the immediate timeline of their operation. Through my bedroom door, I could hear him discussing plans for my psychiatric evaluation scheduled for tomorrow morning, an evaluation I had no memory of agreeing to and which hadn't been mentioned during my last session with Dr. Peterson. "Everything's arranged for tomorrow," David was saying. "Dr. Peterson will conduct the evaluation at 10 a.m., and Dr. Stevens will be there as a consulting psychiatrist to provide a second opinion." Based on Sarah's behavior over the past week, they're both prepared to recommend immediate inpatient treatment for her own safety. Monica's response was audible enough for me to understand the key points. The financial transfers should be completed by Friday, and the insurance documentation is already in place. Once she's been committed, we'll have complete control over all remaining assets, plus the legal authority to make long-term care decisions. Tomorrow. They were planning to have me committed to psychiatric care tomorrow, which meant I had less than 24 hours to execute whatever plan I could develop for fighting back. The inheritance deadline of 60 days was meaningless if I was locked in a psychiatric facility under David's legal control, heavily medicated and isolated from any potential allies who might help me claim my grandmother's legacy. But David and Monica had made one fundamental miscalculation in their assessment of my capabilities. They'd seen my PTSD symptoms and assumed they were evidence of weakness and vulnerability. They hadn't considered the possibility that a soldier who had survived 15 years of military service, including combat deployments in hostile territory, might have developed skills and resources that went far beyond what civilian predators could anticipate or counter. The tremors in my hands weren't just withdrawal symptoms from the medication. They were muscle memory returning as my nervous system began to function normally for the first time in months. The hypervigilance that David and Dr. Peterson had labeled as paranoid thinking was actually the situational awareness that had kept me alive in combat zones. The anger that they'd been medicating away was the righteous fury of a professional warrior who had finally identified the enemy. As David ended his phone call and prepared to leave for his evening meeting with Monica, probably to finalize tomorrow's psychiatric evaluation, I began developing the kind of tactical plan that had made me successful in military intelligence operations. I had less than 18 hours to gather evidence, establish communication with potential allies, and execute a counterattack that would expose David and Monica's criminal operation before they could complete my destruction. The hunter had become the hunted, but these predators had made the mistake of targeting someone who had been trained to fight back against much more dangerous enemies than a small-time criminal operation in suburban Seattle. The systematic destruction of my life had been unfolding for months while I'd been too medicated to recognize the pattern. Now, with my mind finally clearing from the pharmaceutical fog David had been maintaining, I could see exactly how comprehensive and methodical their operation had been. Every aspect of my identity, credibility, and support network had been systematically dismantled while I'd been convinced that my own mental illness was causing the chaos around me. The financial devastation was staggering in its scope and sophistication. David hadn't just stolen money. He'd orchestrated the complete liquidation of everything I'd built during 15 years of military service. The rental properties were gone, sold to buyers who had no idea they were purchasing stolen assets through forged documentation. My investment portfolio, carefully constructed through years of deployment savings and military consulting income, had been systematically emptied through a series of transactions that appeared legitimate on the surface but had never been authorized by me. My disability payments from the VA, which should have been protected from third-party access, had been redirected to accounts David controlled through the power of attorney I'd signed during my most heavily medicated period. The consulting contracts with defense contractors, worth nearly $200,000 annually, had been terminated after David convinced my former clients that my PTSD symptoms made me a security risk. Even my military retirement account had been compromised. David had somehow gained access to funds that should have been legally protected from spousal claims. But the financial theft was just one component of a much larger operation designed to destroy my credibility and isolate me from anyone who might question what was happening. David had spent months systematically poisoning my relationships with family, friends, and professional colleagues by presenting carefully curated evidence of my deteriorating mental state. Every person who cared about me had been convinced that my concerns about missing money and forged documents were symptoms of paranoid delusions caused by my combat trauma. My sister Rebecca, who had been my closest friend since childhood, had been one of David's primary targets for manipulation. He'd shown her video recordings of my worst panic attacks, carefully edited to remove context and emphasize moments when I appeared completely irrational. He'd shared documentation from Dr. Peterson that supported his claims about my deteriorating psychological condition. Most effectively, he'd positioned himself as the devoted husband who was struggling to care for a wife whose mental illness was becoming increasingly severe and potentially dangerous. Sarah called me last week claiming that someone had stolen money from their accounts, Rebecca had told our mother during a conversation I'd overheard through a phone call David thought I was too sedated to understand. But David showed me the bank statements and everything looks normal. He's really worried that she's becoming paranoid and might hurt herself if her delusions get worse. The doctors say this kind of thinking is common with severe PTSD. My former commanding officer, Colonel Martinez, had been equally easy to manipulate because of his genuine concern for my welfare. David had contacted him multiple times over the past few months, providing updates on my condition that portrayed me as a broken soldier who was struggling with the transition to civilian life. Martinez had been told that my therapist recommended minimizing contact with military personnel because discussions of my service triggered severe panic attacks that interfered with my recovery process. I understand that Sarah was an exceptional officer, David had told Martinez during a conversation I'd later found recorded in David's email files. But the person she is now isn't the soldier you remember. The doctors say that some combat veterans never fully recover from severe trauma, and Sarah seems to be one of those tragic cases. Any reminder of her military service sends her into episodes that can last for days. The manipulation of my medical care had been perhaps the most insidious aspect of David's operation. Dr. Peterson, my psychiatrist at the VA, was a dedicated professional who genuinely wanted to help veterans struggling with combat trauma. His expertise in PTSD treatment made him particularly vulnerable to David's manipulation because David had presented him with textbook symptoms of severe psychological deterioration that aligned perfectly with Dr. Peterson's clinical experience. David had been attending my therapy sessions as a concerned spouse, providing Dr. Peterson with detailed observations about my behavior between appointments. Every legitimate concern I raised about financial irregularities was reframed by David as evidence of paranoid thinking. Every question I asked about my medication was presented as resistance to treatment that indicated my deteriorating insight into my own condition. Every moment of clarity or independence was described as a temporary improvement that masked my underlying psychological instability. Sarah's having more good days lately, David would tell Dr. Peterson, but the bad days are getting worse. Yesterday, she spent 3 hours going through our financial records, claiming that someone had forged her signature on legal documents. She was completely convinced that our accountant and real estate agent were conspiring to steal from us. When I showed her that all the documentation was legitimate, she accused me of being part of the conspiracy. Dr. Peterson had interpreted these reports as evidence that my PTSD symptoms were becoming more complex and potentially dangerous. Each session resulted in increased medication dosages and stronger recommendations for inpatient psychiatric treatment. The irony was devastating. The more I recovered from my actual combat trauma, the more David's manipulation made me appear to be deteriorating psychologically. Monica Reeves had played a crucial role in the operation by providing professional legitimacy for the financial aspects of their theft. As a licensed real estate agent with experience in estate planning and asset management, she could create documentation that appeared completely legitimate to banks, title companies, and government agencies. Her signature forgery skills were sophisticated enough to fool multiple financial institutions and legal professionals who had no reason to suspect fraud. The rental property sales had required extensive coordination between Monica and David to ensure that all documentation appeared legitimate while preventing me from learning about the transactions until they were completed. Monica had handled all communications with buyers, title companies, and banks, while David had provided forged authorization documents and managed the transfer of proceeds to accounts I couldn't access. The 3 properties, worth nearly $800,000, had been sold within a 6-week period without my knowledge or legitimate consent. But Monica's role extended beyond just handling real estate transactions. She'd been responsible for creating and maintaining the financial shell companies that David used to launder stolen assets and hide the proceeds from potential investigation. Pacific Northwest Holdings, Cascade Investment Group, and Martinez Property Solutions were all fictitious companies that existed only on paper but had been sophisticated enough to fool multiple financial institutions and government agencies. The psychological warfare aspects of their operation had been equally sophisticated and comprehensive. David had been recording my private conversations, therapy sessions, and worst moments of PTSD symptoms, creating a comprehensive library of evidence that could be used to support claims of mental incompetence. The recordings had been carefully edited to remove context and emphasize moments when I appeared confused, agitated, or irrational. More disturbing was the discovery that David had been medicating me beyond what Dr. Peterson had prescribed. The pills he brought me each morning included not just my prescribed psychiatric medications, but additional substances designed to increase confusion and memory problems. Dr. Stevens, the consulting psychiatrist who would be participating in tomorrow's competency evaluation, had apparently been providing David with drugs that would ensure I appeared severely impaired during any official assessment of my mental state. The combination of medications we've been using should ensure that Sarah appears significantly impaired during any formal evaluation, Dr. Stevens had written in an email I found in David's files. The cognitive testing will show clear evidence of substantial brain damage that makes her incapable of managing complex financial decisions or living independently. Combined with Dr. Peterson's documentation of her PTSD symptoms, we should have no difficulty obtaining a court order for permanent psychiatric commitment. The insurance fraud component of their operation was perhaps the most chilling aspect of their plan. David had purchased a substantial life insurance policy on me, with himself as the sole beneficiary, just months before my final deployment to Afghanistan. The policy included specific clauses that would pay double benefits in cases of suicide or accidental death related to psychiatric conditions. David's communications with Monica discussed detailed plans for making my eventual death appear to be the result of PTSD-related self-harm rather than murder. The psychiatric commitment establishes the necessary medical history, David had written to Monica last week. Once Sarah's been institutionalized for several months, any incident that results in her death will be viewed as the tragic but predictable outcome of severe combat-related mental illness. The insurance investigators will focus on her documented psychological deterioration rather than questioning external factors. But the most horrifying discovery was the evidence that I wasn't David and Monica's first victim. The folder labeled Walsh Project contained detailed documentation of their previous operation against Jennifer Walsh, a widow whose husband had left her substantial assets, including multiple properties and business investments. The timeline and methods were nearly identical to what they'd been doing to me: gradual isolation, financial manipulation, medical gaslighting, and eventual institutionalization followed by convenient death. Jennifer Walsh had died from what was officially ruled an accidental overdose of psychiatric medication while she was a patient at a private psychiatric facility. The facility had been recommended by David, who had been serving as her financial advisor, and the medication had been administered by Dr. Stevens, the same consulting psychiatrist who would be evaluating me tomorrow. The insurance payout from Jennifer's death had been substantial, and David and Monica had used those proceeds to fund the operation against me. The pattern extended beyond just Jennifer Walsh. David's email communications referenced at least 2 other projects involving vulnerable women who had died under suspicious circumstances after being systematically isolated and financially exploited. Monica had been involved in all of these operations, providing real estate expertise and signature forgery services, while David handled the psychological manipulation and medical aspects of their crimes. What made their operation so effective was how perfectly it exploited the legitimate challenges faced by combat veterans dealing with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. My symptoms provided perfect cover for their psychological manipulation, while the complexity of military benefits and veteran healthcare systems made it easy to hide financial fraud. Any investigation into my eventual death would focus on the well-documented challenges of veteran suicide rather than questioning whether I'd been murdered by predators who had systematically destroyed my life. The scope of their criminal network extended far beyond just David and Monica. Dr. Stevens was clearly a key participant, providing medical legitimacy for their operations and access to psychiatric facilities where victims could be held indefinitely under legal medical authority. There were also references to contacts within the banking industry who helped facilitate fraudulent transactions, legal professionals who provided documentation services, and even connections within veteran services organizations who helped identify potential targets. As I absorbed the full scope of what had been done to me and to other women, the rage that had been building throughout the day crystallized into something much more focused and dangerous. These weren't just criminals who had stolen money. They were predators who had developed a systematic method for identifying, isolating, and murdering vulnerable women while making their crimes appear to be tragic accidents or suicides. But David and Monica had made one crucial miscalculation in their assessment of my capabilities. They'd seen my PTSD symptoms and assumed I was just another broken victim who could be easily manipulated and destroyed. They hadn't considered that a career military intelligence officer might have developed skills and resources that went far beyond what their previous victims had possessed. The inheritance from my grandmother represented more than just money. It was proof that I came from a family of women who understood how to fight back against predators and protect themselves from those who would exploit their vulnerabilities. Tomorrow's psychiatric evaluation wasn't just an attempt to have me committed. It was the final test of whether I was still the officer my grandmother had trained me to be. The war had begun, and for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, I felt like Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell again. The first ally I never expected emerged from the shadows at 3:47 a.m. when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was brief, but unmistakable in its implications. Colonel Mitchell, this is Master Sergeant Williams from your Afghanistan unit. Your husband contacted me 6 months ago claiming you were having severe PTSD episodes and shouldn't have contact with former colleagues. Something about that conversation never sat right with me. If you're reading this and you're in trouble, respond with your old call sign. Williams. I remembered him clearly, a communications specialist who had been part of my intelligence team during my final deployment. He was the kind of soldier who noticed everything and questioned inconsistencies, which had made him invaluable in identifying enemy disinformation campaigns. If Williams had been suspicious of David's contact for 6 months, it meant my former colleagues hadn't completely accepted the narrative that I was too psychologically damaged to maintain military friendships. I responded immediately with my old call sign, Eagle Eye. Within minutes, my phone rang. Colonel, I've been worried about you since your husband's call, Williams said without preamble. He told me you were having violent episodes and that contact with military personnel was triggering dangerous behavior. But the way he described your symptoms didn't match the officer I served with. You were always hypervigilant and detail-oriented. That's not mental illness. That's good soldiering. Williams's call opened a floodgate of information I hadn't known existed. Several members of my former unit had been contacted by David over the past months, all with similar stories about my deteriorating mental state and requests that they avoid reaching out to me. But Williams had been keeping informal tabs on the situation through contacts within veteran services organizations, and what he'd learned had made him increasingly suspicious of David's motives. Your disability payments are being processed normally, Williams told me, but someone's been calling the VA claiming to be your husband and asking detailed questions about your benefits and how to access them if you become incapacitated. The VA rep I know said the calls seemed more focused on financial logistics than on your actual medical care. More importantly, Williams had discovered that David had been contacting my former consulting clients, claiming that my security clearance had been revoked due to psychological instability. This was completely false. My clearance was still active, and there had been no negative findings in my background investigations. David had been systematically destroying my professional reputation to prevent me from working with people who might have questioned his version of my condition. Colonel, I need to tell you something else, Williams continued, his voice taking on the serious tone he'd used when reporting critical intelligence during our deployment. I've been asking around about your husband, and what I found isn't good. David Martinez isn't who he claims to be. His real name is David Thompson, and he's got a history with vulnerable women that goes back years. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. David Thompson, not David Martinez. He'd been using a false identity throughout our entire relationship, which meant everything about our marriage had been built on lies. Williams had conducted an unofficial, background investigation using resources available to him through military and law enforcement contacts, and what he'd discovered was a pattern of predatory behavior that extended far beyond what I'd found in David's email files. Thompson's been married 3 times before, Williams reported. 2 of those wives died under suspicious circumstances, and the 3rd one disappeared after accusing him of financial fraud. There are active investigations in 2 states, but he's been smart about covering his tracks and changing identities. Williams had also discovered that Monica Reeves was part of a larger criminal network that specialized in targeting wealthy women, particularly widows and military veterans with substantial assets. The network included corrupt medical professionals, legal document specialists, and financial services providers who could create legitimate-appearing documentation for fraudulent transactions. But the most important information Williams provided was about my grandmother's inheritance. Elizabeth Mitchell hadn't just been a successful defense contractor, she'd been working with federal law enforcement agencies to investigate financial crimes against military families. The inheritance I'd received wasn't just money. It was access to a comprehensive support network that my grandmother had built specifically to protect women like me from predators like David Thompson. Your grandmother left very specific instructions about what to do if someone tried to prevent you from claiming your inheritance, Williams explained. There's a law firm in D.C. that's been handling military family protection cases for decades. They've been expecting contact from you, and they have resources that go way beyond normal legal representation. The law firm, Patterson, Brooks and Associates, had been founded by my grandmother's first commanding officer and had evolved into something between a legal practice and a private intelligence operation. They specialized in protecting military families from financial predators and had developed expertise in exposing the kind of sophisticated fraud operations that David Thompson and Monica Reeves were running. Williams arranged for me to speak directly with Thomas Patterson, the senior partner at the firm and my grandmother's longtime friend. Patterson had been expecting my call since the inheritance notification was sent, and he'd already begun investigating David Thompson's background when I hadn't responded to their initial communications. Your grandmother was paranoid about predators who target military women, Patterson told me during our secure phone conversation. She spent years documenting cases and building resources to fight back against exactly the kind of operation you're facing. The inheritance comes with more than just money. It includes access to investigative services, legal protection, and financial resources specifically designed to expose and prosecute criminals who exploit military families. Patterson had already gathered substantial evidence about David Thompson's criminal history, including documentation of his previous marriages and the suspicious deaths of his former wives. More importantly, he'd identified the broader criminal network that Thompson was part of, including connections to corrupt medical professionals and fraudulent financial services providers. We've been tracking this network for 3 years, Patterson explained. Your case represents the best opportunity we've had to expose the entire operation and bring federal charges against all the participants. But we need you to be strong, enough to fight back, and we need you to trust us with information that could put you in immediate danger if Thompson realizes what we're doing. The support network my grandmother had built was more comprehensive than I could have imagined. Patterson's firm worked with federal agencies including the FBI, Treasury Department, and Veterans Administration to investigate financial crimes against military families. They had forensic accountants who could trace stolen assets through complex money laundering operations. They had medical experts who could document evidence of fraudulent psychiatric treatment. Most importantly, they had the legal authority to freeze assets and obtain emergency court orders to protect victims of financial elder abuse and spousal fraud. But the immediate challenge was surviving until Patterson's team could implement protective measures. David's plan to have me committed to psychiatric care was scheduled for tomorrow morning, and once I was institutionalized under his legal authority, it would be much more difficult to expose his criminal operation or claim my grandmother's inheritance. Patterson's solution was both elegant and risky. His firm would petition for an emergency guardianship hearing, claiming that I was being exploited by someone who had gained access to my finances through fraudulent means. The hearing would be scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, just hours after David's planned psychiatric evaluation. If I could demonstrate competency during the guardianship hearing, it would invalidate David's power of attorney and give me legal protection from further financial exploitation. The key is that you need to appear at both evaluations, Patterson explained. David's psychiatric evaluation in the morning, where you need to seem impaired enough to avoid suspicion, and our guardianship hearing in the afternoon, where you need to demonstrate complete competency. It's going to require perfect timing and flawless performance. The plan was complex and dangerous, but it offered the only realistic chance of exposing David's operation before he could complete my destruction. Patterson's team would use the time between the two hearings to execute a comprehensive investigation that would freeze David's assets, gather evidence of his criminal activities, and coordinate with federal law enforcement agencies to ensure that he couldn't escape justice by changing identities again. Williams would serve as my primary contact with Patterson's team, using secure military communications to coordinate activities without David's knowledge. My phone and internet access were certainly being monitored, but Williams had access to encrypted communication systems that David Thompson wouldn't be able to intercept or decode. The most crucial element of the plan was maintaining the appearance that I was still heavily medicated and psychologically impaired. David couldn't suspect that I'd stopped taking his drugs or that I'd discovered the scope of his criminal operation. I needed to continue acting confused and dependent while secretly preparing for tomorrow's dual evaluations. But I also needed to gather additional evidence that could support Patterson's legal case against David Thompson. The email files I'd discovered were valuable, but Patterson's team needed documentation that could prove David had been systematically drugging me beyond my prescribed medications, and that he'd been coordinating with Dr. Stevens to ensure I appeared incompetent during official evaluations. The solution came from an unexpected source: my own military training in surveillance and intelligence gathering. David had been so focused on medicating me into compliance that he'd forgotten I was a career intelligence officer with extensive experience in covert operations. While he thought I was sleeping heavily from evening medications, I would be conducting my own investigation using skills he'd never imagined I possessed. That evening, as David prepared for his meeting with Monica to finalize tomorrow's psychiatric evaluation, I began implementing a surveillance operation in my own home. Using techniques I'd learned during counterintelligence training, I installed recording devices in David's office and our bedroom, positioned to capture his private conversations with Monica and Dr. Stevens. The recordings would provide Patterson's team with direct evidence of David's criminal conspiracy, including his plans to have me murdered after a period of psychiatric institutionalization. More importantly, the recordings would document David's use of fraudulent medical treatment to incapacitate me and his coordination with corrupt medical professionals to ensure I appeared mentally incompetent during official evaluations. But as I prepared for what might be the most important 24 hours of my life, I realized that my grandmother's inheritance represented more than just financial resources. It was proof that I came from a family of women who understood how to fight back against predators. Tomorrow's evaluations weren't just about claiming money. They were about proving that I was still the officer Elizabeth Mitchell had trained me to be. The hunter had become the hunted, but these predators had made the fatal mistake of targeting someone who possessed both the skills and the resources necessary to destroy them completely. David Thompson thought he was closing in on his latest victim. Instead, he was walking into a trap that had been years in the making, set by a woman who understood exactly how dangerous men like him could be. The surveillance recordings I captured that night revealed a criminal conspiracy far more extensive and horrifying than even I had imagined. David's meeting with Monica and Dr. Stevens in our living room, a room he thought was safe because I was supposedly heavily sedated upstairs, provided comprehensive documentation of their plans, not just for my destruction, but for the systematic targeting of other military women across the Pacific Northwest. Sarah's evaluation tomorrow is just the beginning, David told his accomplices, his voice carrying the cold calculation I'd learned to recognize as his true personality. Once we have her committed and declared incompetent, we can liquidate the remaining assets and move to the next target. Monica's already identified 3 other military widows in the Seattle area with substantial disability settlements and inherited wealth. 3 other women. They weren't just planning to complete my destruction. They were preparing to replicate their operation against other vulnerable veterans. The recordings captured detailed discussions about potential victims, including personal information about their financial assets, family situations, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Dr. Stevens's participation in the conspiracy was particularly chilling because it demonstrated how corrupt medical professionals could weaponize the healthcare system against victims of financial abuse. His role extended far beyond just providing fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. He was running what amounted to a private psychiatric facility where victims could be held indefinitely under the guise of medical treatment while their assets were systematically stolen. The facility in Oregon has capacity for 6 more patients, Dr. Stevens reported during their meeting. We've perfected the medication protocols that ensure long-term compliance without obvious signs of abuse. Most patients remain coherent enough to appear functional during family visits, but cognitively impaired enough to be incapable of managing their own affairs or making credible accusations about their treatment. The facility in Oregon, they were operating a private psychiatric hospital where victims of their financial fraud operations were imprisoned while appearing to receive legitimate medical care. The patients were kept drugged into compliance while their legal guardians, criminals like David Thompson, liquidated their assets and planned their eventual deaths. Monica's role in the conspiracy was more sophisticated than I'd initially understood. She wasn't just providing real estate services and signature forgery. She was running the financial logistics for an entire network of predators who targeted wealthy women across multiple states. Her legitimate business provided perfect cover for money laundering operations that could move stolen assets through complex chains of shell companies and offshore accounts. The Martinez account should be completely cleared by Friday, Monica reported, referring to the fake identity David had been using during our marriage. I've moved everything through the Portland shell companies and into the Cayman accounts. Even if someone eventually investigates, the paper trail will take months to unravel, and by then we'll have completed the Washington operations and moved to California. The Washington operations. They were planning to target multiple victims in our state before relocating their entire criminal enterprise to California, where they'd apparently identified additional targets among military families and wealthy widows. The scope of their operation extended across state lines and involved systematic targeting of vulnerable women with substantial assets. But the most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Stevens discussed the timeline for my eventual death. They weren't planning to keep me alive indefinitely in their psychiatric facility. I was scheduled to die from an apparent suicide within 6 months of being committed, once they'd completed the liquidation of my assets and collected the substantial life insurance payout David had secured. The key is establishing the right medical history first, Dr. Stevens explained. Sarah needs to be documented as having made previous suicide attempts while in psychiatric care. I'll create episodes that appear to be self-harm, but are actually carefully controlled incidents designed to support an eventual suicide ruling. After 3 or 4 documented attempts, her actual death will appear to be the tragic but predictable outcome of severe combat-related mental illness. They were planning to murder me while making it appear that I'd killed myself due to PTSD symptoms. The psychiatric commitment wasn't just about stealing my money, it was about creating the medical documentation necessary to justify my eventual murder. Dr. Stevens had apparently perfected this technique with previous victims, creating false medical histories that provided cover for premeditated murder. The recordings also revealed the extent of their research into my background and the sophisticated preparation they'd undertaken before targeting me. David had been studying my military records, financial assets, and family relationships for over 2 years before our first meeting, which meant our entire relationship had been planned as part of a criminal operation designed to exploit my vulnerabilities. Sarah's isolation from her family makes her ideal for our purposes, David had told Monica during a conversation recorded 6 months ago. Her military background provides perfect cover for psychological manipulation, and her financial assets are substantial, enough to fund our next 3 operations. Plus, her security clearance gives us access to information about other potential targets within the military community. My security clearance. They'd been using my military credentials to gather information about other potential victims within the defense community. David had been systematically compromising national security while planning my destruction, adding federal espionage charges to the growing list of crimes I could document through my surveillance operation. But the recordings also revealed a crucial vulnerability in their operation that I could exploit. Dr. Stevens's fraudulent psychiatric facility was operating without proper federal oversight, which meant he was violating multiple healthcare regulations and potentially facing federal charges for insurance fraud and unlawful imprisonment. If I could provide federal investigators with evidence of the facility's operations, it would expose the entire network of corrupt medical professionals who were enabling financial predators to target vulnerable women. More importantly, the recordings documented David's coordination with criminal contacts in other states who were running similar operations against military families. This wasn't just a local criminal conspiracy. It was part of a national network that was systematically targeting veterans and military widows for financial exploitation and murder. The Phoenix team has completed 3 successful operations this year, Monica reported during their meeting. They're ready to share resources and provide support for expansion into the California market. The Denver operation is also ready to coordinate, and they've identified several high-value targets among recent military retirees in the Colorado Springs area. Phoenix, Denver, California. The criminal network extended across the western United States and was actively targeting military communities where veterans with substantial assets and potential psychological vulnerabilities could be identified and exploited. My case wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic campaign of financial terrorism against American military families. The surveillance recordings provided Patterson's legal team with everything they needed to coordinate with federal law enforcement agencies and expose the entire criminal network. But the immediate challenge remained surviving tomorrow's dual evaluations while maintaining the appearance that I was still heavily medicated and psychologically impaired. David's plan for tomorrow's psychiatric evaluation was particularly insidious because it involved giving me a massive overdose of sedatives designed to make me appear completely incapacitated during Dr. Peterson's assessment. The recordings revealed that David and Dr. Stevens had calculated precise drug dosages that would render me nearly unconscious while maintaining plausible deniability about whether I was receiving legitimate medical treatment. The combination of benzodiazepines and antipsychotics should ensure that Sarah is completely non-functional during the evaluation, Dr. Stevens had explained. She'll be conscious enough to avoid suspicion of drug abuse, but cognitively impaired enough that Dr. Peterson will have no choice but to recommend immediate psychiatric commitment for her own safety. But David had underestimated my knowledge of military counter-drug techniques and my experience with chemical agents that could be used to incapacitate enemy personnel. During my intelligence training, I'd learned methods for detecting and counteracting drugs that might be used to compromise military personnel during capture or interrogation. The techniques I'd learned for maintaining alertness under chemical influence would allow me to appear heavily sedated while retaining enough cognitive function to perform effectively during Patterson's guardianship hearing. The plan Patterson's team had developed was both elegant and dangerous, requiring precise timing and flawless execution. I would need to take David's overdose of sedatives without arousing suspicion, then use military counter-drug techniques to maintain functional consciousness during both evaluations. During Dr. Peterson's psychiatric assessment, I would need to appear sufficiently impaired to convince David that his plan was working. During Patterson's guardianship hearing, I would need to demonstrate complete mental competency while the sedatives were still in my system. Williams had coordinated with Patterson's forensic medical team to ensure that I had access to substances that could help counteract the effects of David's drugs without creating obvious evidence of drug use. The countermeasures were based on techniques developed for military personnel who might be exposed to chemical agents during combat operations, adapted for use against the specific medications David planned to administer. But the most crucial element of tomorrow's plan was the comprehensive evidence package that Patterson's team was preparing based on the surveillance recordings and financial documentation I'd gathered. Federal investigators would be standing by during the guardianship hearing, ready to execute arrest warrants for David Thompson, Monica Reeves, and Dr. Stevens as soon as I demonstrated legal competency to authorize their investigation. The evidence package included not just documentation of the crimes against me, but comprehensive information about the broader criminal network that was targeting military families across multiple states. Patterson's team had coordinated with federal agencies to ensure that simultaneous raids would be conducted against the fraudulent psychiatric facility in Oregon, the money laundering operations in Phoenix and Denver, and the financial services providers who were enabling the network's operations. As I prepared for what would likely be the most important day of my life, I realized that my grandmother's inheritance represented more than just financial resources. It was access to a support network that had been specifically designed to protect military women from exactly the kind of predators who had targeted me. Elizabeth Mitchell hadn't just built a successful business. She'd created a comprehensive defense system that could identify, expose, and prosecute criminals who exploited military families. The recordings I'd captured also revealed something that filled me with cold satisfaction. David Thompson and his accomplices had no idea that they were walking into a trap that had been years in the making. They thought they were closing in on another helpless victim. Instead, they were about to discover that they'd targeted someone with access to resources and support systems that extended far beyond anything they'd encountered with their previous victims. Tomorrow's dual evaluations would determine not just my fate, but the fate of every other woman these predators had targeted or planned to target. The psychiatric evaluation would be David's final attempt to complete my destruction. The guardianship hearing would be my opportunity to expose his criminal conspiracy and ensure that he never had the chance to hurt another military family. The hunter had become the hunted, but tomorrow would reveal which of us had truly been planning for this confrontation all along. The morning of the dual evaluations began at 5:30 a.m. when David brought me what he claimed was my usual medication cocktail, but which I knew from last night's surveillance recordings contained enough sedatives to render most people unconscious for 12 hours. His smile was particularly warm and caring as he watched me swallow the pills, completely unaware that I'd already taken the military-grade countermeasures Williams had provided through Patterson's medical team. "Today's going to be a big day, sweetheart," David said, stroking my hair with practiced tenderness. "Dr. Peterson wants to do a comprehensive evaluation to see how you're progressing with your treatment. I know these assessments can be stressful, but it's important that we get an accurate picture of where you are psychologically so we can make the best decisions about your care." The irony of David discussing accurate psychological assessments while he was systematically drugging me into cognitive impairment wasn't lost on me, but I forced myself to respond with the confused compliance he expected. Within 20 minutes of taking his drug cocktail, I was experiencing the drowsiness and disorientation that would have completely incapacitated me if not for the countermeasures coursing through my system. The counter-drug protocol Williams had provided was based on techniques developed for military personnel who might be exposed to chemical agents during combat operations. The combination of stimulants and cognitive enhancers allowed me to maintain functional consciousness while appearing heavily sedated to outside observers. The challenge was calibrating my performance to seem impaired enough to convince David and Dr. Stevens that their plan was working, while retaining enough mental clarity to function effectively during Patterson's guardianship hearing. Dr. Peterson's psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the VA Medical Center, with Dr. Stevens attending as a consulting psychiatrist to provide what David believed would be a second opinion, supporting immediate psychiatric commitment. David had arranged for Monica to drive us to the appointment, claiming that he was too emotionally overwhelmed by my deteriorating condition to focus safely on driving. The car ride to the VA facility provided additional evidence of their criminal conspiracy as David and Monica discussed final preparations for the psychiatric evaluation while assuming I was too sedated to understand their conversation. Monica had brought legal documents that would need to be signed immediately after Dr. Peterson recommended psychiatric commitment, including authorization for emergency medical treatment and transfer of financial management authority to David's control. "Everything's arranged at the Oregon facility," Monica told David while I appeared to doze in the back seat. "Dr. Stevens has a bed reserved, and the initial treatment plan is already approved. Once Dr. Peterson signs the commitment order, we can have Sarah transferred within hours, before anyone has a chance to question the evaluation or request a second opinion." The Oregon facility, the fraudulent psychiatric hospital where I would be imprisoned and eventually murdered while appearing to receive legitimate medical treatment. The speed of their planned transfer was designed to prevent me from having any opportunity to challenge the psychiatric commitment or contact anyone who might question their authority to make medical decisions on my behalf. David's response revealed additional details about their operation that I filed away for Patterson's legal team. "The insurance documentation is already processed, and the life insurance beneficiary information has been updated. If something happens to Sarah while she's in psychiatric care, the payout will be substantial enough to fund our next 3 operations, plus provide retirement security for both of us." If something happens to Sarah. David was discussing my planned murder as casually as he might discuss vacation plans, while I sat 3 feet away pretending to be unconscious from the drugs he'd given me. The casual cruelty of his attitude toward my destruction was almost as shocking as the systematic nature of his criminal operation. Dr. Peterson's evaluation began exactly as David and Dr. Stevens had planned. I was barely responsive to direct questions, appeared confused about basic information like dates and locations, and seemed incapable of focusing on complex topics for more than a few seconds at a time. My performance was convincing enough that Dr. Peterson showed genuine concern about what appeared to be significant cognitive deterioration since our last session. "Sarah, can you tell me what year it is?" Dr. Peterson asked gently, his professional demeanor reflecting real worry about my apparent condition. I responded with the confused hesitation that David expected, giving an answer that was off by several years and seeming uncertain even about that basic information. David immediately provided helpful context about my increasing confusion and disorientation over the past several weeks, painting a picture of someone whose cognitive function was rapidly deteriorating. Dr. Stevens played his role perfectly, asking pointed questions designed to demonstrate my inability to make rational decisions about my own care or financial affairs. His questions focused specifically on topics that would be relevant to legal determinations of mental competency, creating a comprehensive record of apparent cognitive impairment that could support immediate psychiatric commitment. "Mrs. Martinez," Dr. Stevens said, using the false surname David had been employing throughout our marriage, "do you understand why you're here today? Can you explain what concerns your husband has about your current condition?" My response was carefully calibrated to seem confused and paranoid, while avoiding any statements that might accidentally reveal my awareness of David's criminal activities. I expressed vague concerns about people trying to control me, but presented these worries in a way that seemed like classic paranoid delusions rather than accurate observations of actual criminal behavior. David's performance during the evaluation was masterful in its apparent concern and devotion. He provided detailed examples of my deteriorating behavior, expressed genuine-seeming anguish about my condition, and repeatedly emphasized his commitment to ensuring I received the best possible medical care. To outside observers, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed, a loving husband struggling to cope with his wife's severe mental illness. "I've been documenting Sarah's episodes over the past several months," David told the doctors, producing a thick folder of materials that appeared to comprehensively document my psychological deterioration. "She's been having increasingly severe, paranoid thoughts, claiming that people are stealing from us and forging her signature on legal documents. Last week, she spent an entire day going through our financial records, convinced that our accountant and real estate agent were part of some conspiracy against her." The documentation David presented was sophisticated and comprehensive, including video recordings of my worst panic attacks, audio recordings of conversations where I'd expressed concerns about missing money, and written reports of incidents where I'd appeared confused or disoriented. The evidence would have been convincing to any medical professional who didn't understand that my concerns about financial theft were completely accurate and that my confusion was being caused by unauthorized medication. Dr. Peterson's recommendation was exactly what David had been hoping for: immediate psychiatric commitment for comprehensive evaluation and treatment of what appeared to be rapidly deteriorating PTSD, complicated by possible traumatic brain injury effects. The recommendation included authorization for emergency medical treatment and temporary suspension of my legal capacity to make decisions about my own care or financial affairs. "I'm very concerned about Mrs. Martinez's current condition," Dr. Peterson told David with genuine professional worry. "The cognitive impairment and paranoid thinking represent a significant deterioration from her previous functioning level. I believe she requires immediate inpatient psychiatric care for her own safety and to prevent further psychological deterioration." David's relief was visible but carefully controlled, expressing appropriate gratitude for Dr. Peterson's professional opinion while avoiding any appearance of satisfaction about the outcome. He signed the necessary authorization documents with what appeared to be reluctant acceptance of medical necessity, while Monica handled the logistical arrangements for transferring me to the Oregon facility. But as we left the VA Medical Center, I was already preparing for the second phase of the day's plan. Patterson's guardianship hearing was scheduled for 2:09 p.m. at the federal courthouse, just 4 hours after Dr. Peterson's psychiatric evaluation. The timing was crucial. I needed to appear at the hearing while the effects of David's drugs were still obviously present in my system, but demonstrate complete mental competency despite the chemical impairment. The counter-drug protocol Williams had provided was designed to reach peak effectiveness during the afternoon hours, allowing me to function at full cognitive capacity while still showing obvious signs of having been heavily sedated earlier in the day. The combination would provide compelling evidence that David had been systematically drugging me beyond legitimate medical necessity, while demonstrating that my underlying mental faculties were completely intact. Williams was waiting at the courthouse. When we arrived, along with Thomas Patterson and a comprehensive legal team that included federal prosecutors, forensic psychiatrists, and financial investigators. The guardianship hearing had been scheduled as an emergency proceeding based on evidence that I was being financially exploited by someone who had gained access to my assets through fraudulent means. David's shock at discovering the guardianship proceeding was complete and devastating. He'd arrived at the courthouse expecting to sign final paperwork authorizing my transfer to the psychiatric facility, only to find himself facing federal investigators who had spent days preparing comprehensive evidence of his criminal activities. "Mr. Thompson," Patterson said, using David's real name deliberately, "we have some questions about your financial management of Mrs. Mitchell's assets over the past several months. We've identified numerous transactions that appear to have been conducted without proper authorization, and we'd like to give you an opportunity to explain these irregularities." The use of my real surname and David's actual identity immediately revealed that Patterson's team had uncovered the scope of his deception. David's carefully constructed false identity was crumbling in real time, exposing years of systematic fraud and identity theft that extended far beyond just the crimes against me. But the most powerful moment of the hearing came when I was called to testify about my mental competency and understanding of my financial situation. Despite the obvious effects of the morning's drug overdose, tremors, dilated pupils, and visible sedation, I was able to provide clear, detailed, and completely accurate testimony about my assets, the transactions that had been conducted without my authorization, and the systematic campaign of psychological manipulation that had been used to compromise my ability to protect my own interests. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the chemical impairment that was obvious to everyone present. "I am Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, United States Army, retired. Over the past several months, the man I knew as David Martinez has been systematically drugging me, forging my signature on legal documents, and stealing assets worth nearly $2 million while planning to have me permanently institutionalized and eventually murdered." The contrast between my obvious physical impairment and my completely lucid testimony created exactly the evidence Patterson needed to demonstrate that David had been using unauthorized drugs to compromise my cognitive function while my underlying mental faculties remained intact. The federal investigators were ready with comprehensive evidence of David's criminal conspiracy, including the surveillance recordings I'd captured, financial documentation of fraudulent transactions, and background information about his previous victims in other states. The guardianship hearing became the foundation for federal charges that would ensure David Thompson never had another opportunity to target vulnerable women. As federal agents placed David and Monica under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and attempted murder, I realized that my grandmother's inheritance had provided me with something far more valuable than money. It had given me access to a support network capable of exposing and prosecuting the kind of sophisticated criminal operations that targeted military families. The hunter had become the hunted, and the trap that had been years in the making was finally closing around predators who had destroyed too many lives already. The moment David Thompson's handcuffs clicked into place, his carefully constructed facade of devoted husband finally crumbled completely. Standing in the federal courthouse, surrounded by investigators who had documented every aspect of his criminal operation, he made one last desperate attempt to maintain the psychological manipulation that had been his most effective weapon against me. "Sarah, you have to understand that everything I did was to protect you," David said, his voice carrying the same patronizing tone he'd used during months of systematic abuse. "You're not thinking clearly because of your PTSD. These people are confusing you, making you believe things that aren't true. I'm your husband. I love you. Don't let them turn you against me." Even facing federal charges and overwhelming evidence of his crimes, David was still trying to use emotional manipulation to control my perception of reality. The arrogance was staggering. He genuinely believed that his psychological conditioning had been so effective that I would choose him over my own safety and freedom, even when presented with documented proof of his intention to murder me. But my response was delivered with the cold precision of a career military officer addressing an enemy combatant. "Mr. Thompson, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, not Sarah Martinez. You are not my husband because our marriage was based on fraudulent identity. You do not love me because you have been planning my murder for months. And I am thinking more clearly than I have in months because I stopped taking the unauthorized drugs you've been using to chemically incapacitate me." The devastation on David's face was complete. For the first time since I'd known him, he was confronting someone he couldn't manipulate, control, or deceive. The broken woman he thought he'd created through systematic psychological abuse had been revealed as the tactical deception of a professional intelligence officer who had been gathering evidence for his prosecution. Monica Reeves's arrest was equally satisfying, particularly because she had underestimated my awareness of her role in the conspiracy. While David had focused on psychological manipulation, Monica had handled the financial and legal aspects of their operation with what she'd assumed was complete impunity. Her shock at being confronted with comprehensive documentation of her forgery activities and money laundering operations was evidence of how completely she'd underestimated the resources available to someone with my background and connections. Was just providing real estate services, Monica protested as federal agents secured her hands behind her back. David told me Sarah had authorized all the property sales. I had no idea there was anything irregular about the transactions. Agent Sarah Chen, the federal prosecutor leading the investigation, immediately challenged Monica's claims with evidence that demolished any possibility of claiming ignorance about the criminal nature of their activities. The surveillance recordings I'd captured included detailed conversations where Monica had discussed forging my signature, drugging me into compliance, and planning my eventual murder as part of their systematic operation. Ms. Reeves, Agent Chen, said, producing transcripts of Monica's recorded conversations, "We have comprehensive documentation of your participation in identity theft, signature forgery, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit murder. Your claims of ignorance are contradicted by hours of recorded conversations where you discussed specific details of the criminal operation, including plans for Mrs. Mitchell's death and the distribution of insurance proceeds." Dr. Stevens's arrest was coordinated simultaneously with raids on his fraudulent psychiatric facility in Oregon, where federal investigators discovered evidence of systematic abuse against multiple victims who had been imprisoned under the guise of medical treatment. The facility had been operating as a private prison where wealthy women were held indefinitely while their assets were stolen by criminal guardians who had gained legal authority through fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. The scope of Dr. Stevens's criminal operation was staggering in its systematic cruelty. Federal investigators found evidence that he had been running similar facilities in 3 states, imprisoning dozens of women whose only crime had been possessing substantial assets, while being vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Many of the victims had been held for years, heavily medicated to prevent them from being able to communicate effectively with family members or legal representatives who might have questioned their treatment. But the most shocking discovery was that several women had died in Dr. Stevens's facilities under circumstances that had been ruled suicide or accidental overdose, but which showed clear evidence of murder when investigated by federal forensic specialists. The insurance payouts from these deaths had funded the expansion of the criminal network and provided resources for targeting additional victims across multiple states. Dr. Stevens has been operating what amounts to a murder-for-hire operation, disguised as psychiatric treatment, Agent Chen explained during the press conference that followed the arrests. His facilities were designed to imprison wealthy women while their assets were systematically stolen, with plans to eventually murder the victims once their financial resources had been completely depleted. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that the criminal network extended far beyond just David Thompson, Monica Reeves, and Dr. Stevens. Financial records seized during the arrests revealed connections to similar operations in Phoenix, Denver, and Los Angeles, all targeting military families and wealthy widows using identical methods of psychological manipulation, financial fraud, and eventual murder. The breadth of the conspiracy was both horrifying and validating. My case wasn't unique. It was part of a systematic campaign of financial terrorism against vulnerable women across the western United States. The evidence suggested that dozens of women had been targeted, with many of them successfully destroyed by criminals who had perfected their methods through years of practice. But the federal investigation also revealed something that filled me with cold satisfaction. My grandmother's inheritance had been the trap that finally exposed the entire network. Elizabeth Mitchell hadn't just been a successful defense contractor, she'd been working with federal law enforcement agencies for years to identify and prosecute financial predators who targeted military families. Your grandmother spent the last 5 years of her life building the legal and investigative framework that made today's arrests possible, Thomas Patterson explained during our meeting after the courthouse proceedings. She knew that predators like Thompson were systematically targeting military women, and she created a comprehensive system for identifying investigating, and prosecuting these criminals. The inheritance I'd received wasn't just money, it was access to a private intelligence network that had been specifically designed to protect military families from financial predators. Elizabeth Mitchell had used her defense contracting business to build relationships with federal law enforcement agencies, creating a unique partnership that could investigate crimes against military families with resources that exceeded what was available through normal civilian law enforcement channels. The 60-day deadline for claiming your inheritance wasn't arbitrary, Patterson continued. It was designed to create a window of opportunity for criminals like Thompson to reveal themselves through attempts to prevent you from accessing your grandmother's resources. Elizabeth knew that any predator targeting you would try to interfere with your ability to claim the inheritance, and those attempts would provide the evidence necessary for federal prosecution. My grandmother had been playing chess while Thompson thought he was playing checkers. Every aspect of the inheritance conditions had been designed to expose financial predators while providing their victims with the resources necessary to fight back effectively. The competency evaluation, the time deadline, the requirement for independent legal representation. All of it had been calculated to create circumstances where criminals would be forced to reveal themselves through their attempts to prevent their victims from accessing protection. The financial recovery was comprehensive and immediate. Federal asset forfeiture laws allowed investigators to freeze all accounts and properties that had been purchased with stolen funds, including the properties David and Monica had acquired through fraudulent transactions. The Cayman Islands accounts Monica had mentioned during her recorded conversations were accessible through international law enforcement cooperation agreements that my grandmother's legal team had helped establish. We've recovered approximately $3.2 million in assets that were stolen from you and other victims, Agent Chen reported during our debriefing session. This includes not just your original assets, but additional funds that Thompson's network had stolen from previous victims. Under federal forfeiture laws, these additional assets become compensation for the systematic fraud and attempted murder you experienced. But the most important aspect of the recovery wasn't financial. It was the exposure and destruction of a criminal network that had been destroying military families for years. The evidence gathered through my case provided federal prosecutors with everything they needed to dismantle similar operations in other states and prevent future victims from experiencing the systematic abuse I'd endured. Dr. Peterson's professional reputation was protected through the investigation's findings that he had been systematically deceived by David Thompson's sophisticated manipulation. The medical records Dr. Peterson had maintained actually provided crucial evidence of David's criminal activities, as they documented the progression of symptoms that were inconsistent with legitimate PTSD treatment and suggested external chemical influence. Dr. Peterson's notes contain multiple observations that, when reviewed by federal medical experts, clearly indicate that your symptoms were being artificially induced through unauthorized medication, Agent Chen explained. His documentation actually helped prove that David Thompson was systematically drugging you beyond prescribed levels to maintain psychological control. The investigation also revealed that David had been compromising national security by using my military credentials and security clearance to gather information about other potential targets within the defense community. His access to classified information about military families and their financial assets had been a crucial component of the criminal network's ability to identify and target victims with substantial resources. Federal counterintelligence agencies were conducting a comprehensive review of all information David had accessed through my credentials, but preliminary findings suggested that his espionage activities had been focused on financial rather than national security intelligence. The information he'd gathered had been used to identify military families with substantial assets and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited through psychological manipulation. As the immediate legal proceedings concluded and David Thompson was remanded to federal custody to await trial, I found myself facing a choice that would define the rest of my life. The inheritance from my grandmother provided me with financial security and access to resources that most people could never imagine. But it also came with the responsibility to continue the work Elizabeth Mitchell had begun, protecting military families from predators who would exploit their service and sacrifice for criminal gain. The decision was easier than I'd expected. 3 soldiers had died in the convoy explosion that brought me home from Afghanistan, and their sacrifice deserved to be honored through something more meaningful than my personal recovery. David Thompson and his criminal network had tried to use my combat trauma as cover for their systematic destruction of military families. The most fitting response was to ensure that no other veteran would face the kind of predatory abuse I'd experienced. Standing in the federal courthouse where David Thompson's criminal empire had finally collapsed, I realized that my grandmother's inheritance had given me something far more valuable than money. It had provided me with a mission that would honor both my military service and the memory of the soldiers who hadn't made it home from Afghanistan. The hunter had become the hunted, and the prey had revealed herself to be the most dangerous predator these criminals had ever encountered. The federal courthouse was still buzzing with activity 3 hours after David Thompson's arrest when Judge Patricia Morrison called the emergency asset forfeiture hearing to order. What followed was the most comprehensive financial devastation I had ever witnessed. A systematic legal dismantling of a criminal empire that had taken years to build and would be destroyed in a single afternoon. Agent Chen presented the court with evidence that extended far beyond the crimes against me. The investigation had uncovered bank records, property deeds, insurance policies, and investment accounts that revealed the true scope of David Thompson's criminal network. The numbers were staggering: over $15 million in stolen assets across 7 states, representing the systematic destruction of at least 37 women over the past decade. Your Honor, Agent Chen addressed the court, the defendant Thompson has been operating under multiple false identities across several states, targeting vulnerable women with substantial assets. The evidence shows a pattern of fraud, identity, theft, and murder that represents one of the most sophisticated financial predation operations we have encountered. The asset forfeiture proceeding moved with remarkable speed, thanks to the comprehensive preparation my grandmother's legal team had undertaken. Thomas Patterson's firm had spent years developing legal frameworks specifically designed to rapidly recover assets stolen from military families, and their expertise was evident in the precision with which they dismantled David's financial structure. Every property David and Monica had purchased with stolen funds was immediately seized under federal forfeiture laws. The luxury condominium in Portland, the beach house in California, the investment properties in 3 different states, all of it, had been acquired through systematic theft from women who had trusted David with their financial security. The properties would be liquidated, with proceeds distributed among verified victims of the criminal network. But the financial recovery extended beyond just real estate. Federal investigators had traced David's money laundering operations through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts, recovering funds that had been stolen from victims dating back 8 years. The Cayman Islands accounts Monica had referenced in her recorded conversations contained over $4 million that belonged to women who had been murdered after their assets were systematically depleted. The offshore accounts contained detailed records of every transaction, Agent Chen explained to the court. Thompson's network maintained comprehensive documentation of their criminal activities, apparently for the purpose of ensuring accurate distribution of stolen assets among network participants. This documentation now provides us with evidence of crimes against victims we hadn't previously identified. The insurance fraud component of the financial recovery was particularly satisfying. David had purchased substantial life insurance policies on multiple victims, including a $2 million policy on me that would have paid double benefits in case of suicide. Federal investigators were coordinating with insurance companies to void these policies and recover any benefits that had been paid out following suspicious deaths of previous victims. Jennifer Walsh's family would finally receive justice for her murder. The insurance investigation into her death had been reopened based on evidence from David's case, and federal forensic experts had determined that her supposed suicide had actually been murder carefully staged to appear self-inflicted. The insurance company would be required to pay benefits to her legitimate heirs, rather than to David Thompson, who had collected nearly $3 million after orchestrating her death. Dr. Stevens's fraudulent psychiatric facilities were subject to comprehensive asset forfeiture that would compensate every woman who had been imprisoned under the guise of medical treatment. The facilities themselves, worth approximately $12 million, would be seized and converted into legitimate treatment centers for veterans struggling with PTSD and traumatic brain injury. "The irony is perfect," Patterson observed during a break in the proceedings. "The facilities that were used to imprison and abuse victims will now provide actual medical care for veterans who need legitimate support. Your grandmother would have appreciated the poetic justice, but the most comprehensive aspect of the financial, recovery was the systematic identification and compensation of victims who had been destroyed by David's network over the past decade. Federal investigators had discovered detailed records that Thompson's organization had maintained, apparently for internal accounting purposes, that documented every crime against every victim with meticulous precision. The records revealed that the criminal network had been far more extensive than even federal investigators had initially suspected. Operations in 12 states had targeted over 60 women, with successful thefts totaling more than $30 million. Many victims had been murdered after their assets were depleted, while others had been left alive but financially and psychologically destroyed. Catherine Rodriguez, the woman I'd spoken with during my preparation for the guardianship hearing, was among the victims who would receive substantial compensation from the asset forfeiture proceedings. She had been living in poverty for 3 years after David's previous identity had stolen nearly $2 million from her, but the recovery would restore her financial security and provide resources for rebuilding her life. "Sarah, I can't express how grateful I am," Catherine told me during a phone call after the court proceedings. "I thought I would never see justice for what David did to me. I've been living in constant fear that he would come back to finish what he started. Knowing that he'll be in federal prison for the rest of his life gives me the first real peace I've had in years." The federal charges against David Thompson were as comprehensive as the financial recovery. The indictment included 47 separate counts spanning multiple federal jurisdictions: conspiracy to commit murder, identity theft, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to violate civil rights, and domestic terrorism charges, related to his systematic targeting of military families. The domestic terrorism charges are particularly significant, Agent Chen explained during our post-hearing briefing. Thompson specifically targeted military families because he knew their service-related trauma could be exploited for psychological manipulation. This represents a systematic attack on American military personnel and their families, which elevates his crimes to the level of terrorism against our military community. Monica Reeves faced equally serious charges for her role in the conspiracy. Her expertise in financial documentation and real estate transactions had been crucial to the network's ability to launder stolen assets and create legitimate-appearing documentation for fraudulent transactions. Federal prosecutors were treating her as a full partner in the criminal enterprise rather than just an accomplice. Dr. Stevens's charges included not just his participation in the financial fraud, but also federal healthcare fraud for operating unlicensed psychiatric facilities and systematic medical abuse of patients. The evidence showed that he had been deliberately administering harmful medications to healthy women in order to create genuine psychological symptoms that would support claims of mental incompetence. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the legal proceedings was watching David Thompson's reaction as the full scope of his exposure became clear. Throughout our marriage, he had maintained complete confidence in his ability to manipulate and control every situation through psychological warfare. Facing federal prosecutors who had documented every aspect of his criminal activities, he was finally confronting consequences he couldn't charm, manipulate, or lie his way out of. His attempts to maintain innocence were pathetic and transparent. Even with overwhelming evidence of his crimes, including his own recorded conversations planning my murder, David continued trying to claim that he had been acting in my best interests, and that federal investigators were misinterpreting his legitimate efforts to care for his mentally ill wife. David Thompson will spend the rest of his life in federal prison, Judge Morrison announced when she handed down the preliminary ruling on his detention pending trial. The evidence presented today demonstrates that he represents a continuing danger to vulnerable women and that no conditions of release could adequately protect the community from his predatory behavior. Life in federal prison without possibility of parole. David Thompson would never again have the opportunity to target vulnerable women or use psychological manipulation to destroy innocent lives. The man who had planned to murder me while making it appear that I had committed suicide would instead spend his remaining years in a concrete cell, finally facing consequences for a decade of systematic predatory behavior. The broader implications of the case extended far beyond just the prosecution of David Thompson's criminal network. Federal agencies were using the evidence from my case to investigate similar operations across the country, leading to arrests and prosecutions in multiple states. The legal frameworks my grandmother's team had developed were being adopted by other jurisdictions to protect vulnerable populations from financial predators. Your case has become the foundation for federal legislation that will provide enhanced protection for military families and other vulnerable populations, Patterson explained during our final meeting at the courthouse. The Elizabeth Mitchell Protection Act will require enhanced oversight of financial transactions involving veterans with PTSD or traumatic brain injury, making it much more difficult for predators to exploit military families. The Elizabeth Mitchell Protection Act would establish federal protocols for investigating financial abuse of military personnel, require enhanced background checks for individuals seeking power of attorney over veterans' affairs, and create specialized units within federal law enforcement agencies to investigate crimes against military families. But the most important outcome of the legal proceedings wasn't the punishment of criminals or the recovery of stolen assets. It was the systematic prevention of future crimes against military families. The investigative techniques and legal frameworks developed through my case would protect countless other veterans from experiencing the kind of systematic abuse I had endured. As the court proceedings concluded and David Thompson was transported to federal detention, I realized that my grandmother's inheritance had provided me with something far more valuable than financial security. It had given me the opportunity to transform personal trauma into systematic protection for other military families, ensuring that the sacrifice of soldiers like those who died in my convoy would be honored through meaningful action rather than just memory. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a mission to protect the military community from predators who would exploit their service and sacrifice for criminal gain. Standing in the federal courthouse where David Thompson's criminal empire had been systematically destroyed, I understood that my real work was just beginning. The hunter had become the hunted, the victim had become the prosecutor, and the quiet wife had become the most dangerous enemy that financial predators would ever face. 2 years later, I stood in the boardroom of the Elizabeth Mitchell Foundation, looking out at the Seattle skyline where my grandmother had built her legacy. The foundation now operated in 15 states with a simple mission: hunt predators before they hunt military families. Our success rate was extraordinary. 43 criminal networks dismantled, over 200 women protected, $97 million in stolen assets recovered and returned to victims. David Thompson's life sentence had become the template for prosecuting financial terrorists who targeted military families. But the most satisfying victory came yesterday when Maria Santos called. She was the military widow in Phoenix who our investigators had identified as David's network's next target. Her husband had died in Iraq, leaving her with substantial life insurance and 3 young children. A man calling himself Michael Rodriguez had been courting her, gaining her trust, positioning himself to steal everything. They would have destroyed my family, Maria told me through tears of gratitude. My children would have lost everything. Their father died to provide them. Thank you for saving us. Dr. Stevens died in federal prison last month. Monica Reeves won't be eligible for parole until 2045. David Thompson will never breathe free air again. The Foundation's war room displays photos of every woman we've saved, every predator we've stopped, every family that remained whole because someone was watching. My grandmother's paranoid brilliance had created something unprecedented, a systematic defense against those who would exploit American military families. If this story moved you, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because tomorrow, I've got something extraordinary lined up for you. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Stories like these remind us that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about protection. Until next time, stay strong, stay vigilant, and remember, predators count on silence. We give voice to the victims.